All right, there we are. So yeah, we were talking about how, in general, there's this culture, not just, we started talking about corporate culture and how people are so process oriented now that they're not really willing to think outside the box and take risks. That there's few startup type entrepreneurs who do that, but for the vast majority, that's not how their minds are oriented, because we're kind of enculturated to think this way. But even more broadly, that goes beyond corporate culture, that's society itself. We're seeing now more and more how certain public measures are put through without much due diligence or without really following through the necessary steps laid out. And people are willing to accept it because they've become so process oriented. Just want to get your thoughts on that, Steven.
Yeah. And so, it's interesting because, we're in America, we're in the West, and the West has this founding myth. And I don't say myth in like a false way. I don't say that to like denigrate it, but it has a myth at the heart of its culture, and it's the myth of the individual, which we take for granted, but it's also very fascinating. That didn't exist. There was a time where that notion was just not a notion that anybody believed. I mean, and it's difficult for me to, you look at the origin of that and you try to separate the Christian notion of a soul, and I don't know how you get to the individual if you remove that. This is a side point, but I find that interesting. But we have this founding myth of the individual, and we have this value structure of self-actualization. Now, that's not well defined. That doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, but you can go through our cultural comms, our communication, our media, and you can find these notions of find your own meaning in life. You have a purpose, discover it. Oh, me? I have a purpose. I've got to go do the work to find it, right? And that's an alien notion in a lot of cultures, right? That's not like, purpose is handed down, meaning is handed down. What you're supposed to do in life is handed down. And here we say it's something you go out and achieve. But what I think is interesting is I don't think many people, A, actually do that, B, want to do that. They would much rather live in what is a more comfortable state of staying within the box that has been created. And even in a culture that pays lip service to individuality and self-actualization, we still have that box. So it's something interesting where I think most people don't want what that would actually entail, because it would be uncomfortable, it would be challenging, and it would require kind of standing in your own two shoes, being willing to say, hey, this is how I see it, and this is how I'm going to live my life. And I don't care about your opinion. I don't care about how you're going to receive that. And people think they can do that. They think they're like that. But what they don't care about is the opinion of the other side. There's some other side in culture, and they don't care about what those people think, but they care about what these people think. And not to say that one should not care what anybody thinks, because that's its own kind of dysfunction, but there is an autonomy that's asked for. And I think most people don't want to live that way.
Yeah, the way I see it, what we call individuality in society isn't individuality at all. It's the myth of the individual, like as you said. It's the illusion of a freedom. It's like, if Soviet Union, you went to buy a toothbrush, you went into the store, there was one toothbrush, maybe two kinds of toothbrush, a hard toothbrush, a soft toothbrush. You bought the toothbrush that better suited you. You go to Walmart, there's 5,000 kinds of toothbrushes, and you say, wow, I live in such a free country. I have so many toothbrush choices. But is freedom really the number of toothbrush choices you have? And it really isn't. And it's interesting because, yes, North America, the West thinks of itself as, where the individual is the highest ideal to aspire to. And yet, you look at suburbia as a perfect example of how there is a total lack of individuality. Every home looks the same, every driveway, everyone's got the same tools in their sheds, all of that. And that's the model that America was built on. So it's just another version of that kind of group herd mentality that we're talking about, just a different flavor than what you would find in Asia. But to be truly individual means to be determining one's path forward in a way that the group's opinion or the consensus opinion isn't really impinging on the decisions you're making. You're taking those risks for yourself. And I find even within, whether it's work culture or political culture, people are taking their cues from what the consensus is, right? They're not really making those decisions for themselves.
Absolutely, because it's a form of responsibility. You have to be responsible for yourself and your thought process, how you're making decisions, where you're sourcing your information. I mean, it fundamentally requires energy. It requires effort, right? It's not the easier path in many ways. Perhaps it is the path with better fruits, and maybe you would be more satisfied, you'd be in some ways, but you'd also have more challenges in others. And I think people perhaps index more highly, I'd rather avoid challenge than have aspire towards like greater fulfillment, right? Like it's rather not have the negative than really be like, all right, I'll take the negative if it gets me to this better positive, right? In a simple way of putting it.
So what, in your opinion, is self-actualization then in a culture in which that sort of groupthink is the norm in one way, shape, or form, whether that be, you're raised in an Asian culture like I was, where you basically had three options to life, three paths, you pick one of those three formulae, or you come to North America where you have 1,000 options to life, but there's still different formulaic paths you're picking from. You're not actually charting that path yourself. So what does self-actualization look like? Is it just which path I pick? And does that really make an individual in that case?
Yeah, I don't think it's just with which path I pick, right? Because any individual, right? Like none of us have perfect freedom, right? Like our self-actualization or our freedom is not defined by what options are available to us, right? We all are born with certain tendencies and capabilities. I might be good at some things, you might be good at others. Sure, maybe I could work extremely hard for decades to go in a different direction, but ultimately, we all have a context that we're born into. And I don't think, and I'm kind of going off the cuff here because it's a difficult thing to define, but it's the way in which we inhabit our life. It's not what choice we make or even the fact that we have a choice, because like you said, I mean, picking from 500 different styles of toothbrush isn't freedom, right? Ultimately, like, if you put a rat in a maze with two options, they're not free. They can pick one of the two options, but they're not free. They're in a maze. But in some ways, like there's this ideal, there's this like abstract notion of freedom, that freedom means like total unrestriction, which isn't what freedom means, right? Freedom is in many ways the ability to, I think, chart your own course, which sounds like making a choice, but to chart your own course within a given set of boundaries. And I think it's the manner in which we inhabit that, right? So it's kind of saying, why do I make a given choice? What actually is the reason? What is the influence by which I am choosing A or B or C or D? And I think there's a way where we can choose one thing or another. We make a choice, but are we making that choice because that's what our parents told us to do, because that's what our culture told us to do, because we're so afraid of taking a financial risk that we're going to compromise into like something we really don't want to do, but, is secure. And so I think it's the process. I think it's the process by which that we inhabit ourselves as the ultimate authority on our life, that we are ultimately the person who is responsible. And we are not, at the end of the day, when all things are considered, we all have obligations to other people. Sure. I'm not painting some hyper individualistic, every person's an island. We all have obligations. Those obligations are fine. But at the end of the day, at the top of the hierarchy, the person we are responsible to is ourselves. We are responsible to our own decisions. And that almost structure of yourself at the top of that hierarchy, in many ways, that is self-actualization, right? It is having no culture, no authority figure, no whatever. That is ultimately who you're beholden to, even if you take those people into account.
Yeah, when I talk to people, I often talk about the idea of being free from something versus being free in something, right? And this is what our culture has created, is this illusion of freedom because of the vast majority of, the plethora of choices we have available to us. However, people still feeling very trapped, very anxious, very depressed, that sort of notion of Thoreau's, that mass of men and women lead lives of quiet desperation, that hasn't really changed. That trend of human beings living these quietly desperate lives hasn't changed. If anything, that's just amped up with the economy, with the pressures of life, all of that. And in fact, I see it even in my kids sometimes, how too much choice can cause paralysis by analysis, this fear of missing out. If I have one thing, but then that means I can't have the other. Whereas in a simpler world, you can only just have one thing, so that anxiety doesn't really exist. And, I've thought about this. It occurs to me that in cultures that were very obviously oppressive, becoming aware of your own oppression, internal and external, is easier. And so, when we look at wisdom teachings that have come down to us and in the form of Eastern wisdom, all of this comes from times when, we lived in more oppressive times from a political standpoint, monarchies and things like that, and caste systems and creed systems and all of this. And people were actively always aware of how oppressed they were. And that became kind of the catalyst for maybe the odd one person to go, hey, maybe my circumstances will never change, but then is my freedom contingent on my circumstances? Or is freedom something else that is within me to find, that is independent of the circumstances? But that opportunity at least existed, whether a person took it or not. In our society, inundated as we are with billions of trivial choices, your brain doesn't even go there. And I see this even with my phone. Like, I'll be sitting around and absentmindedly, I'm not even aware of it, I whipped out my phone and I'm like browsing something. And I realized, like, there's so much stimulus in the environment. And so there's so much reactiveness that's happening automatically for everybody, that space for that thought to even settle, hey, do I need to be doing this right now? Do I need to be reacting or responding to whatever the circumstance is demanding of me? Doesn't exist.
Yeah, you make it an excellent point there, right? And it's this notion of like freedom from or freedom within, and I love that distinction, and I've even used that distinction because it like you're saying, in a society where like you were born a peasant, or you were born in a low caste, or you were born in whatever, you did not harbor the illusion that you were going to be the king, right? Like, nobody thought, hey, I was born in the lowest caste and I'm going to be the monarch. That just wasn't possible. But in our society, right, we have, everybody thinks they're going to be the president. Everyone thinks they can be whatever they're going to be. And, that's fine. I'm not even really like criticizing that, but it creates this illusion that there aren't boundaries. And then in certain senses, and it then creates an approach where, instead of ever running into the question, is my freedom independent or dependent on my external circumstances, you just forever think, oh, well, let me just change the external circumstances, because there's actually no barriers there. So if I feel unfree, well, it's just on me to tinker and engineer the world outside myself. And I think that's really harmful. It reminds me of, I read this, there's this great classic book that actors read called The Actor Prepares. And in it, there's this phenomenal story of a director. And he's talking about, you know, directing a stage performance. And he says that first you have everybody get on stage and you let them do whatever they want. You let them just express however they want, inhabit the characters however they want. They have total freedom. There's no rules, there's no restrictions. And the actors love it. They love it. They have fun, they do their stuff. And eventually something good bubbles up. So out of that creative process, eventually something that you want to repeat, that you want to, oh, that was good. That's how we're going to do it. Because ultimately you have to do it some sort of way. And at that point, the obligation of the director is to kind of impose some boundaries and impose some restriction and say, hey, okay, when you're delivering this line, you need to face the audience. You can't have your back to the audience, or, you know, you got to, you know, you need to hold the person when they're crying. Like, you can't just like walk away. And what the author says is that, you know, they'll often experience this as like a restriction, but in many ways it is the dawn of freedom and in the dawn of art. When there is no restriction whatsoever, it's in many ways chaos. And so when you create boundaries, you actually create the potential for freedom within those boundaries, freedom within that structure. A similar kind of example is, you know, it's not to step on any political toes, but if there were no collective human military organizations, then it's a free-for-all. You don't have any freedom, because at any point some marauder can come over the hill and kill you and your family. There's no freedom. But ironically, these kind of military and defense structures and you know, these countries, they actually create boxes with which, you know, a military invasion cannot occur. Someone can't just, you know, at least hopefully, you know, there's a lot of restrictions of someone just breaking into your home and doing whatever. And you actually have, paradoxically, freedom within that restriction. And so that's kind of a, you know, an outer lens on that. But obviously there's also, you know, an internal component, you know, that you're talking about, of like, you know, the freedom within the individual, regardless of circumstances. And I think it's mirrored in the outside world too.
Yeah, you know, I've always imagined, what would total freedom of circumstances look like, right?
Yeah.
And if we just take living circumstances, for example, right? I have hot water pumping into my taps anytime I open them, cold water on demand. I've got the heat going right now, nice and toasty inside, even though it's -5 degrees outside and snowing out and icy, all of this, right? And if I had total freedom, well, then I have to accept that none of this would exist. I would have to now take responsibility for my freedom, which means I have to learn how to fetch water in the middle of the winter. How does one do that? Hot water, well, now we got to go chop wood to be able to start a fire, to now boil that water. And if I start going through that exercise of what it would take to recreate just this moment right now that I'm having with, and forget technology, me talking to Steven in fucking Florida on the phone. That's not happening. I don't know how to do that. But let's say just this comfort that I have right now, well, the effort it's going to take is monumental, and makes me go, wait a second, I don't know if I want to put in that effort.
Yeah.
So right there, I'm making a decision to trade off some of my freedom so that I can hold somebody else responsible for keeping me warm. And if I don't want to hold that person responsible, and I want to have the freedom to do what I do, then now I have to be responsible for keeping myself warm. There's no two ways about it, right? And I think that's the part that most people in, you know, human potential movement, spirituality, self-improvement, whatever, glosses over, or if they mention it, they won't really hyper-focus on it, or generally even avoid mentioning altogether, is that with every step of actualization, what you're really doing is taking responsibility. You're not finding freedom, you're taking responsibility. And in that taking of responsibility, you're freeing somebody else up of the responsibility of providing that for you, right? Yeah. So for example, my wife has, you know, started her own business, and she's learning in real time what a different reality that is from working from somebody else. Yeah, working for somebody else, you got a boss and somebody telling you what to do, when to take vacation. Now you don't have to do that, but guess what? There's 100 other things you have to worry about now that you never had to worry about before. And so there's always that trade-off. And that trade-off component is what helps us mature, is understanding those trade-offs and understanding what trade-offs are we ready for. I'll give you another little example. The other night, I asked my daughter, because I was busy in the kitchen, I'm like, oh, I think I forgot to lock the car. Can you run outside and do it? But it was dark outside. And she looks at me and goes, but Dad, it's dark outside. I'm afraid because it's a busy street and, we get shady people walking up and down every once in a while. And I said, you'll be fine. You're just running out to lock the car. And here I was suddenly giving her a freedom that she'd never experienced before. And she actually didn't want it. Yeah. She was afraid to take it because she intuitively understood that freedom now comes with another component that's a safety issue that I've never had to worry about. And so I said, all right, I'll just watch you from the window, don't worry. And she checked to see if I was peering through the window as she went and locked the car and came back in the house. It's like a 10-second deal, right?
Absolutely. It's this notion of freedom that is free from all these restrictions it's anti-human, right? It's anti-human. To be human is to rely on others. It is to extend trust. You can't, like, a world where you don't trust anybody else to provide something for you. You're not a fucking human being. You're not. That's not what this life is. We extend trust to our romantic partner, and we must compromise, right? Our freedom is impinged in a sense of, I don't even mean that in a negative way, but just if you have a romantic partner, there's going to be something that you might want to do that you don't get to do. Like, even in a very just broad, like, hey, they need you to, do an errand for them at some time. Well, if you were totally free, you wouldn't need to do that errand, but you do, because you've extended trust, and there's a network, there's a web of trust that goes from you to others, from others to you. There are obligations, there are, people provide stuff for you, even emotional support and relationship and connection, and they want the same thing back in return. And, far from being transactional, it's not a transactional thing. It's a human, it's a deeply human thing. And I encounter this kind of in my, actually in my job, in my work a lot, because in the industry I work in, there's a lot of thought about the notion of trust and what is a system that requires trust and what is a system that requires no or less trust. And there's merit in that. And there are certain systems, money, I think, is one of them, where excessive trust can be abused very easily and is very detrimental. And so a notion of minimizing trust in neutral infrastructure in society, it makes sense. But a lot of people take that and they take it to an extreme and say, like, oh, well, everything should be trustless. It should be automatic. You shouldn't have to trust professionals and experts and these networks of trust. And I think that's an immature, it's a fundamentally immature worldview, right? You're never going to achieve that, right? Especially as the world has gotten complex. Maybe 2,000 years ago, you could know everything there was to know if you worked very hard. You could learn to smelt metal and to weave cloth and to make a shoe and to feed a horse. But today that's impossible. And no one did it back then either. But the notion that you could understand finance and medicine and biochemistry and exercise and buying a home and all these things, you're never going to know it all. There's too much knowledge in the world. And so you're going to have to extend trust to others, and you're going to rely on them because you're not going to be able to vet everything for yourself. And so this notion of, just this notion that you're going to get out of this life without, being in a network of other people is, absurd. Immature.
Yeah. And if we tie that into that, the whole culture of spiritual seeking and the seeking of enlightenment, at least in my case, I can only speak for myself. If I reflect back now, it was deeply tied into a sense of, trauma that I experienced in my youth, but also a lot of being afraid and unprepared for a world that was coming my way that I had no idea how to negotiate with, being unwilling to take on those responsibilities. And so in a way, I thought my easiest solution to all of this was to choose ultimate freedom, because ultimate freedom then means I don't have to deal with that world that's full of responsibilities.
Get out of jail
I
free
get
card.
to bypass that whole thing because I will be ultimately free. I will be enlightened. I will have nirvana. And then the bills and the politics and the bullshit that all these unenlightened people are constantly squabbling and worrying about won't be my problems because I will be above it all. Obviously, that's not the case. So we've just discussed it. We both agree we're on the same page that that's not a very mature view of what enlightenment is. It is actually a very childish kind of adolescent view of it. But then if we were to, posit that there is such a thing as ultimate freedom, and let's just entertain that assumption for a second.
Yeah.
There is such a thing as ultimate freedom. What does that ultimate freedom look like from a mature perspective?
I feel like, what that looks like, and, you get into definitions here, right? I think there's something that we could vaguely point at in that direction, but it's not what people think. And it's, you've kind of touched on it already with, freedom within versus freedom from, but going further than that, it's like this notion that people think that ultimate freedom, like, for example, would mean like, I'm not bothered by what happens. Like, stuff happens, horrible things, challenging things, and I'm just like, I'm not impacted by it. And that would be freedom. I'd be free from my triggers and my trauma and my reactiveness and all these things. And far from that being the case or, possible in any way. Like, obviously, like, if you got trauma, you can work on it and maybe you can resolve some things there and it can get better. Like, I'm not saying like throw your hands up and there's nothing to do, but you're never going to be free from all of it. It's never going to be this perfect freedom. But the real freedom is being free within that trigger or within that impact or within that anger or within that, like, you're free to experience it. It's not a problem. Like, you're not in this constant battle with like, oh my God, I'm attached to something. How unevolved of me. Like, no, you're free to have attachment. You're free to have, anger and trigger. You're free to be unenlightened, right? Like, that's the real freedom. And it's not like that's not like a self-contradictory statement. Well, that doesn't sound like very free. No, actually, it is very free. It is experienced as extremely free because you don't realize that so much of the weight of these things that you're trying to escape are really just the way you're engaging with it. It's the way you're in opposition, you're in a war with it. And if you just let yourself, like, and that's the wrong phrasing. You're not letting yourself. It's not like this thing that you're, oh yeah, let me sit back here and allow myself. Like, no, that's fucking bullshit. But colloquially, if you just experienced it, it would be different. And the freedom is in, like, it's this perpetual surrender that doesn't feel like the thing you think when you hear the word surrender. It's just an immediacy. It's just life. You're just here. You're just doing it. And yeah, you're pissed and you're angry and you're flawed and you're attached and you're anxious and whatever. And, cool. Hopefully maybe that, improves and we all continue to develop and grow as people where we have less of that, but it has nothing to do with freedom, right? Like, the presence or absence of those things has zero to do with freedom.
Yeah, I look at most of my peers, the people I know, associate with, who are around my age. I'm in my early 40s, and they're all reaching that point in their lives where they're having one kind of crisis or another, right? Whether that be a relationship crisis or an existential crisis. And most of them are doing something about it in the form of some kind of self-improvement technique or yoga, whatever it might be. And I've had conversations with them where, they're like, how come you don't do any of that? How come you're... And, my answer is, I just don't have a problem with the way I respond to life. And they say, oh, you think you're so perfect? I said, no, far from it. I'm not perfect at all.
Yeah.
I have all kinds of issues.
Yeah.
But I also understand that these issues will gradually resolve themselves over time with maturity. I'm going to be way more mature at 60 than I am at 40, and at 80 than I am at 60, because I know I'm way more mature at 40 than I was at 20. And it's just an extrapolation of a certain trend. And so I'm not in a rush to smooth out my rough edges. My rough edges are going to be my rough edges. And yeah, my reactions to circumstances sometimes may be far from optimal, and they may even be below average. I don't know.
Yeah,
But there's nothing within me that says, oh no, this is a problem I gotta fix.
exactly.
I'm
Yeah.
fine being a fuck up in some ways and being, not a fuck up in other ways. And it's all fine because life works. Life is working. The question I have for you, and I want to mention this because both you and I have something in common. We have both had been privy to a certain experience, whether you call it an awakening experience in spiritual literature or whatever, in spiritual culture or whatever you want to call it. But we've had that experience of suddenly and spontaneously being given a glimpse of life beyond this narrative of the self in such a way that it's had an impact on us. And I can tell you from my own experience, no matter how complicated my life gets, and it's funny you were talking about buying a house because I'm right in the middle, and we just put an offer last night. And there's all these fucking
it's an ordeal,
negotiations.
man. It's an ordeal. It's such people don't talk about it.
I was always the kind of guy who said, I will never buy a house. Just like I was always the kind of guy who said, I will never get married. And guess what? I did get married, and guess what? I am buying a house. And it's just annoying, and
it's an emotional roller coaster. You're getting your hopes up. This is my future house. You're imagining your life. Oh my God, there's an issue with they didn't inspection, and there's mold, and with the offer, and
right, exactly. So all that is going on, and then we realize, oh, but we have a food trailer, but the road's too narrow. How are we going to back it in? All this shit's going on, and so you're fully invested in it, right? And emotionally, you're not sleeping. I woke up at 4 a.m. with another question in my mind. But how would that work? And then I couldn't sleep after. And yet, in the background, there's always this lightheartedness about how ridiculous this all is. And yet, I'm participating in full-fledged with full gusto. And that's the immediacy we're talking about, is the willingness to still dive in there and just go with all of what's happening, right? For those people who, to them, this might just be really true sounding words that resonate with them, but they don't have that position, that experience from which they've actually firsthand seen that. How would they navigate this? Because they were, then that just becomes another sort of authority in their head saying, oh, because Shiv said this, or because Steven said this, it must be true. Freedom in and not freedom becomes a mantra, becomes a doctrine, becomes a dogma.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I answer that, I want to add one thing. One of the things that really struck me about kind of that change, that shift in perspective, right, is the freedom to be in tension or to be in conflict, even like an argument, but not that I try to go around arguing with everybody, or I'm always trying to fight with my girlfriend or something. But when that does happen, and when I am in tension, it's it's not a problem. It's no part of me experiences that as oh my God, something's wrong. I'm doing something wrong. It's just, there's this, I feel like there's this much greater capacity to experience the, maybe inevitability is the wrong word, but just we're humans. This is what it's gonna be like. You have no escape from this, and it's okay. It's not our judgment of it being wrong or imperfect is just completely constructed. So just one thing that it made me think of. And, this question of how does someone relate to it? I think this is probably the most unexamined question in all of spirituality and discussion, because it's essentially a mechanistic or a causal question. It's saying, well, what does one actually do? What actually, assuming someone hears this and they're oh, that sounds great. I'd like that, but I don't have that, or at least I don't experience that. What do you do? And, you know, there's a million people willing to sell you something, right? There's a million people willing to sell you this technique and that technique and, you know, whatever. Do they work? Does that actually get you from A to B? I don't know. I don't think many people know. We had a really interesting conversation on this on Facebook. And so I don't have an answer for people. I have questions, and maybe I'll lay out some of those questions because I think they're interesting. There's this paradox where even on the other side of it, it's very, very difficult for me. I have a really hard time saying that. So let's just take meditation, which is a really broad term. And there's different forms of meditation. There's actually one form of meditation I like. I like effortless meditations. There's certain categories. You're not concentrating on something. I actually get a lot of, does that lead to awakening? Completely separate question. I enjoy that meditation. I still do it. I get pleasure from it. It's enjoyable. Makes me feel good. Does it do something beyond that? That's a different question. But like, let's take meditation. It's difficult to say that there's like a causal line, like, okay, if you meditate for 500 hours, you get awakened, right? Like, we know that's not the case because we all can meet people who have meditated for 500 hours or 1,000 hours or 30 years, and that hasn't happened. And then we can meet people who have meditated for 100 hours or 10, and that has happened. Or we can meet people who have never even heard of meditation who have had that happen. And so there's obviously not like a clean line there. There's nothing incredibly consistent for us to look at. But the other thing that I have difficulty saying is, well, okay, so then could we take the position that just says like, okay, there's just absolutely no correlation, no relationship whatsoever between all of spirituality and people who experience, you know, awakening? And I have trouble saying that too, because, you know, the number of people that just sit on the couch drinking beer and the number of those people who have this experience is significantly lower than the number of people who engage in some capacity in the spiritual landscape. And so what you said, we were having that conversation, and what you said was, well, you know, maybe it's not the practice itself. It's not that doing this thing gets you here, but that the sorts of people and the qualities that those people have and the way they approach life, and even this question that's alive in them that do these practices, are much more likely to have this experience than the people sitting on the couch drinking beer. And even though some of those people can have it too, it's not that they don't. It's not that nobody, like, that has happened. And I think that's interesting. And like, I can get behind that. And what I kind of like about this, and I don't know if this is what you mean when you say it, but what it makes me think of is that there's this, you might have an issue with this, but because it kind of positions the seeking a little bit, but the impulse, whatever in these people, this unsatisfied, this questioning, there's something I'm not getting here. I'm in my life, and there's something that just doesn't quite add up. I feel like there's something more. I don't know what that is. And I'm right, I'm going to meditate about it, or I'm going to pray about it, or I'm going to go to this workshop, or I'm going to do therapy about it. But it almost positions it that question, that uncertainty, that longing, maybe is really the thing that crosses the shore. Maybe that's really, it doesn't really matter what you do. It just matters that that's alive in you, and maybe you cultivate, you nourish it a little bit. You don't snuff it out, right? Like, I think if you don't snuff it out, it'll grow. It's not really that you have to like, you know, Wim Hof the fire or something, you know, but you can suppress that. You can dissociate from that. You can shut that down. And I think if you don't do that, maybe that's the vehicle. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and I actually don't have a problem with you saying that, because I make a very clear distinction between yearning and seeking. It's the difference between having a is the difference between having a craving for a cigarette and smoking, right?
Yeah.
The seeking is the action you take to react to the yearning within you. And that seeking then becomes a diffusing of that energy. you're diffusing it because it's an unbearable energy. That yearning, that longing, it's like
Ooh, yeah,
right. It's like a longing for a long lost love. Like that's
yeah,
how strongly I felt this yearning within me when I was
yeah,
young. It was just this yearning for self knowledge, for self realization. It was like all consuming. It was all the time. It was as badly as
yeah.
wanting, grieving someone you've lost. Right. It felt like that. And so what do you do when you don't know what to do with that energy? You end up trying to find solutions to it. And that trying to find solutions is what is called seeking, what I call seeking.
Okay.
And what I tell people is that the trying to fix it or trying to solve it is actually not going to get you to the solution.
Yeah.
The seeking will not actually help. It's the yearning which is the most important component. And so meditation just becomes a form of seeking. It's an institutionalized technique to manage that yearning energy and focus it in a certain way. May work for some people in some ways, may not. But in general, it tends to diffuse a little bit of that yearning. That yearning has to feel unsatisfactory. It has to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It has to feel like being on fire on the inside. I remember writing so much poetry about just feeling like I was inflamed on the inside.
Absolutely.
And that is what triggered my awakening experience, not all the meditation I did. All the meditation I did would actually make me feel better about it, would manage my anxiety, would manage my stress, would manage my ennui.
Yeah.
But it just couldn't do it long enough. And then it would come out and flare up, and then flare up in my relationships. It would flare up in my life. It will flare up in the way I responded to people and circumstances. And that feedback then caused more suffering. That brought me to that threshold where that snap happened. Now, again, this is not prescriptive by any means. It's not to say that's the only way it can happen either. But that's the only component I have seen is that true longing for it. It has to be it cannot be manufactured. It cannot be artificial. It cannot be culturally imposed. It cannot be done because it feels good or we want to do it because that's the cool thing to do. It has to be like you need it, like you need air.
Yeah. And I mean, that was my experience of it too. It was a desperate, inflamed longing. And that's how I experienced it too. And I never, I explored stuff. I, like read books and, but I never really like did a certain technique for 5 years and went to the workshop and here I am today. And so I've always kind of been like, like the association is weak there. It's not required, but I actually, that feels very true to me, right? Because what I always felt was, it really was that longing and attending to that longing. And what you said about, well, meditation actually made it better, like less intense. I think that's really interesting, because I think one of the chronic tendencies of people in the spirituality world and in this dialogue is they're always trying to manage their negative emotions. Like they're chronic managers. Like they really, really want to get rid of all of the negative experiences, which seems very counterproductive. So it's interesting to say that even the like longing itself for whatever we want to say it's longing for, itself is uncomfortable, and they seek to kind of get rid of that discomfort. I think that's really insightful. It actually reminds me of something I've come to believe to be true somewhat, which, crosses on some areas I'm often just as liable to critique. But something I found in life, and this is going to sound a little bit like manifestation, but hear me out, is that I've almost come to see experientially that the longing for anything is the most important part. It's almost the longing brings you to it. I've seen it in the, there was a time that I didn't have any money, right? I was financially unstable, and I had a real longing. I had a real longing that I wanted that not to be the case. I wanted to be financially stable. I wanted to be able to take care of the people in my life. I wanted to have, a certain measure of external freedom. And I didn't know how I was going to do that. And the journey was all over the place, right? Like the road there was non-linear. I didn't plan it out. The only thing that was truly consistent in that process was I was really like, I need this and I'm gonna do this. Like there's a strong longing. And if I look back from like well, what can I say? What can I really attribute to success in that pursuit? The only thing I can really attribute is that I felt that longing very strongly and I went with it. And so I've seen that to be true in other ways as well.
Yeah, and you know, I have no problem with manifestation type.
Yeah.
I would don't want to call them teachings because I do have a problem with the teachings. But the idea that we attract experiences to us that are in measure and proportional to the degree in which we long or yearn for them.
Yeah.
The problem I have is with then trying to create some kind of pseudoscience around,
Yeah.
let me teach you now how you can manifest that.
Yeah.
Or trying to create some kind of a metaphysical science of how there is another realm in which these intentions that, how about let's not explain it? How about let's just talk about our own experiences? And in my own personal experience, that's exactly how it's been.
Yeah.
The things I have yearned for the most, I won't say yearn for the most because this goes into a gray territory because everybody yearns for more money, right? Everybody does.
Yeah.
But, well, just, my headphones,
and
my
this was
headphones
different.
are
No.
Yeah. So what I was saying, sorry, let me just finish that. So everybody yearns for something, but there's something that takes over in a way that is a very focused energy, right?
Yes.
It's an energy that, whether you like it or not, is literally directing every faculty that you have and hyper focusing it in. It's like this laser focus.
Exactly. 100%.
And maybe there's a part of you that doesn't want to go there, doesn't agree with it, or is not aligned with it. That's where we suffer because we're like, why am I on this ride? I don't want to go there, but it's just going there.
Yeah.
And those are the yearnings, not the oh, I wish my life was better. I wish I won the lottery. Yeah. That's not yearning. That's complaining. That's kind of lamenting your lot in life, right?
Yeah. Or just intellectualizing what you want. It's just thinking about what you want. And that's what I always, when I was in that period of my life, which was for several years, it was just this kind of burning thing for years. And it was just like what I was doing. I was all in. It was just, and like you said, it was almost this independent thing. It wasn't me being like, well, it would really make sense to do this, or wow, I really want to be the sort of person, or I want to think about what I want. It was just like very alive, very direct, very immediate, very all-consuming. And yeah, like that is what that means. It's not just, everyone has things they want. Everyone has things they desire. Everyone has an image of what they think it'd be cool that their life was like. But that's I agree with you. That's not this at all. These things, and this is, I've kind of made this point before, that we discover our own desires. We don't create them. We don't generate them. We stumble upon, oh my God, I really want this. And it's almost this like third person in a sense, like it's you, but like, it's almost this like, wow, I didn't know I really wanted this, but I do really want this. And that's not how most people think of desire, which I think is a fundamentally good thing, by the way. Like for the anti-desire crowd, fuck that. Like desire is life. You're alive. You want things. And I think kind of like a way to think of this is like, people that are like, they're in a relationship, it's not that good, there's problems, but they're still in it, they're too comfortable to break up, probably younger, hopefully not older, sometimes older. And then one day somebody wakes up and they're like, I don't want this. This isn't right. I want something different. This relationship isn't working. What's happening there? They're discovering, it was unknown to them, their own desire. They didn't know that they wanted it. They discovered it. And in that sense, it paints the self, or, the experience of our personhood, right? Like, which exists, continues to exist, is non-absolute. It's not the highest, most absolute truth, but relatively it's real, it's here, you're going to experience it till you're dead. And it positions the person as a process of like discovery. We're discovering ourselves. We're in a creative, exploratory, and like, if you want to, impose almost a theological lens or another lens, it means something to me, but like, you were gifted yourself. You received yourself. It was not like you got it. You were given this person that you are, and you're in this process of discovery. You're not in the driver's seat. And I actually think that that's a really potent way to engage in life. I actually think when we have that relationship to ourself as this discovery, this process, this, embodiment, like, I think we actually become much more effective. We become much more clear. We aren't in like this war with our own desires and tendencies and flaws. It's this amazing process of being a person that I think gets like chopped up and manhandled and denigrated and like painted as either sin in the Christian sense or as illusion in the Eastern sense. Either way, not very kind to the people. And it's bullshit.
Yeah, I think we live in a culture where we have the pressure to impose upon us at all times to have to know what we want.
Yeah.
And we kind of brainwash ourselves into thinking we know ourselves and know what we want a lot more than we actually do. So I'll give you an example, because you brought up relationships. And, when I was younger, I was in plenty of relationships where the person I was with checked all my boxes, right? And I had like a laundry list of things I wanted. They checked all my boxes, but the relationships were empty, hollow, right? And the relationship I'm in now, which has been a relationship that has lasted now for 20 years with my wife, was a relationship where more than 50% of the boxes were not checked at all. And was a relationship I never would have imagined I'd want to be in. And I'm thriving in that relationship because it's the relationship I truly want. And this is why I have a problem with these manifestation visualization practices, because what I've come to see is that the future, the reality that you truly want is not one you're going to be capable of visualizing right now.
Yes.
And the reality you can visualize is not the one you really want, because it's the one that's going to be relevant to the you of today, not the you of tomorrow. The you of tomorrow would have evolved past the you of today, is not going to value the things the you of today want. So unless you can have that reality right now, and that's why this immediate gratification culture, people want things right now, because they realize that what if I change by the time I get there? And that's a constantly moving goalpost, the reality I want. And they're not willing to say, oh, you know what, maybe I don't know what I want, but I feel the wanting within me. There's a yearning within me. There's a desire. Trust that desire. Instead of wanting to do something about it, follow it through to where it takes you. And this is the way I've lived my life. I've just followed through on the intuitions and the impulses I've had, trusting which ones are sort of genuine and trustworthy, and which ones are clearly, me, like, stressing out about what would happen if I didn't. Because coming from a position of strength rather than fear, and then leading me into all kinds of life experiences, making me freaking living in rural Japan, running a rickshaw on the streets of Toronto. Like, I've done weird shit, right? And each one of those experiences, each one of those, that was a brutal week. It only lasted a week. Each one of those experiences have brought me to this point to be able to live the life I have today. And had I not had those, I wouldn't be able to enjoy the life I do. If I hadn't had those relationships, I wouldn't be able to enjoy this one. So everything has had to have happened in order for this to be happening, right?
Yeah. You mentioned checking the boxes, right? this is one of the things I find hilarious, that people have these criteria, like the dating apps have like commodified it, right? Like they've made it literal. It's not just like someone's metaphorical list. Like they literally, like, you set criteria or you can. And I find this hilarious because I'm like, I can't even answer that question. Like I wouldn't even know how, like I literally, it's impossible. Like I can't, what? Like any answer I give is just this abstraction of myself. It's this like crazy, like, what sort of person would I want? Like, what? I can't even begin to, outside of like, standards or whatever. Like I want someone that can communicate clearly with me, or I want a like functional fucking relationship. But like what sort of height, or what sort of body type, or what sort of like profession, how much money do they make? What do they like? I don't know. I don't care. That's not important at all. I mean, it's maybe important in the moment of like compatibility and like, I don't know, you're a vegan and I'm a butcher. But even there, I bet that couple exists and they're happy. But yeah, this notion of like the knowability of our own desires or self is just, it's so fanciful, it's so abstracted, it's so detached from experience. It just like, you do direct investigation, you don't find that. That's not there. You discover your wants in the moment. You discover your desires as you go along, as they come alive in you, and they change, and you want different things. And the stuff that, and you also, and this was the other thing, like one of the questions I'll sometimes get asked in a couple of contexts is like, okay, so like, where do you want to see yourself in 5 years? And I'm like, I have no idea. Like, I don't even know who I'm going to be in 5 years. Like, that's a false question. Like, it doesn't, like, yeah, maybe I can like construct some very vague, like, like, well, I want to be, in a relationship I enjoy, which I am. Like, I want to be, whatever, like some very vague stuff. But there's this tendency, I think, in our society that like, what are your goals for your life in 10 years, in 5 years? And it's like, I literally didn't know that the thing I do today existed several years ago. I couldn't have planned for it. I love it. It's amazing. I enjoy everything I do. When I was in school, I had no idea this even existed. There's no way I could have targeted it. And every single job I ever got, every kind of move in my career was unbeknownst to myself. It was completely non-discernible ahead of time. I didn't sit there and come up with a plan and then shoot out 50 resumes to the type of company that I wanted. In many ways, it was, I met people, it was organic, or I saw a job ad one day and I was like, okay, yeah, that feels good. But yeah, this notion of like, that the person, the self, our desires is like clear and knowable to us, like outside of what just arises as we live it. I think it messes most people up. And I think the reason it's really a shame, for among other reasons, is that I would make the argument that when you live in this way, when you live in this direct way where you're just responding to what's actually there, you are more effective. I'd even argue you're probably going to be more successful. You're going to have more of, most likely, the good stuff that everyone's trying to get after. And they think that planning and abstracting and conceptualizing of everything, well, that's what's going to get you to the life that you enjoy, to whatever that is for you, whatever success is, whatever a good life is for you. And I think the opposite is actually true. I think that's the fastest way to get yourself into a life you don't enjoy, that doesn't meet your needs. And that, ironically, there's this tremendous clarity that takes you to, I'm not trying to like paint a picture that says, oh, live this way and everything will be good and you'll never experience anything bad and you'll get everything you want. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But also, I'm not saying that it has absolutely no impact on your life and outcomes, because I do actually believe it does have an impact. It does make you clearer. It does make you more effective. You are more likely to be in situations that actually work for you, at least if you don't completely deny that to yourself.
Yeah, that's something, you and I have discussed recently as well, is even from a career perspective, you and I orient very similarly in the fact that we don't orient the way the rest of the work culture generally does, planning out their careers, planning a formulaic career path and trying to move one step at a time. You have literally catapulted in your career within a very short span of time, as have I.
Yeah.
And I want to get to that a little bit. It's what you do. But, I returned from Japan about less than 2 years ago, having been out of the workforce for an extended period of time. I got a job, my first job back here in a software company as a project manager. And within, a span of year to 9 months, I went from PM to senior PM to director to senior director to VP, 5 promotions in a very short span of time. And most people are like, well, it took us 20 years to get there. You're there in a year and 9 months. And my answer is, well, I never planned on it. I just did what I do best. And that was how it unfolded. And that's not to say that I didn't capitalize on those opportunities
Sure.
as I saw them coming. I absolutely saw them coming, and I absolutely knew when to pull the trigger and put the right kind of pressure to be able to gain that position. But it wasn't with some kind of overarching plan or agenda in mind. So talk a little bit about yourself and the kind of work you do and what that's been like, that arc has been like for the last few years.
Yeah, no, I really, we talked about this before, but I really relate to what you just shared. And I think the kind of commonality, one of the commonalities between us is we were both, call it out of the workforce. So we were engaged, I'm assuming because you were engaged in kind of that spiritual arc of your life is probably the predominant reason there. It was the same thing for me. And, not that I didn't do anything during that time, obviously, I did some stuff, but it wasn't really cohesive. And my primary, like all my attention was on this kind of spiritual, yearning and all of that. And so I wasn't really engaged. And, I wasn't fully engaged on the work side of it. And so on the other side of that kind of resolving, that yearning kind of resolving for me, within 6 months, it kind of hit me over the head like, oh man, I have been really not focused on these worldly questions of career and money and how the world works, on a functional, pragmatic level. And if I don't get into gear here, if I don't figure this out, like my life's probably not going to be that great. Like I've seen a million. I mean, I'm sure you've seen them too, of all the graveyard of the spiritual industry, right? Like the graveyard of people who, and not to say that maybe they didn't get anything from it, but they often paid a high price of like they're poor, their lives are not great, right? They spent a really long time engaged in this sort of internalized pursuit. And their life is tough on an external basis. Like maybe they feel good in it. And I'm not diminishing the importance of that, but there really
that's a really good point. I just want to interrupt there for a second. I think that's a really good point you make. That is one of the reasons why the spiritual industry is as corruptly oriented as it is. I think it's a lot of people now trying to capitalize on the one thing that they invested all their time into to be able to make a buck, because they ran out. They have no other options. They have no other options. They ran out of time to gain the skill sets. The workforce finds them irrelevant. What are they going to do? They got to survive. And so now this becomes their one trick pony that they're now trying to monetize. A lot of them probably feel kind of bad about it, kind of feel hypocritical, but what choice do they have left? And that creates this bed of dishonesty in an industry that really should be elevating to a level of honesty and transparency that no other industry can match, right?
Yeah. It's incredibly convoluted and self-contradictory. And the beliefs and assumptions around money and like, there's both this kind of, like, they're monetizing this because they really have no other discernible source of income or skills. And then there's also like, you're unenlightened if you become a bond manager, right? Like, like imagine like okay, I got enlightened. What do you do now? Well, I manage a bond portfolio for Goldman. Well, you're not enlightened. There's
Yeah,
really crazy stuff
you're
there.
materialistic because you're
You're
managing
so
wealth.
materialistic. You
Right.
can't achieve the supreme realization and then go trade countries' debt. But you totally can. Anyways, but so yeah, what happened for me is, I was, in the way that so many people are, like I was very focused on that, fortunate enough that, I, didn't spend 30 years doing that. And, I kind of came out of that and, in a fruitful way. And, after, a little while, after some contemplation, this really, hit me over the head. And so I work in the Bitcoin space. And I was, it was something that interested me kind of shortly before that kind of transition, that's kind of internal shift had happened. And, I was assessing my options. And like you just said, like, I didn't have, I had a college degree and, I'd kind of operated a small business. And I didn't have, like a long list of discernible work experience or anything. So I was assessing my options and I was saying, well, I'm really interested in this thing. And my bet was there wasn't a lot of gatekeeping. So there wasn't a lot of like credentialism, right? Like nobody has 40 years experience in Bitcoin. Like you don't have a PhD in Bitcoin. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to give this a shot. Like, I don't know how it's going to go, but I'm interested in this. I'm really interested in this. And I don't need to like do further education because I really didn't want to do that. I really felt like that was a waste of my time in terms of like degrees and stuff. So I kind of just started freelancing in the very beginning and started, working with some very small tech companies and, advising some wealthy individuals and consulting and helping people. There's a lot of interest in the space and the interest was a little cyclical. So, sometimes, there was a lot of interest and I did that. It was very, kind of in the beginning, like, like anybody starting up a business, like, hit or miss and a little unstable. And, I got some, eventually got some longer term contracts with some companies that were doing adjacent work. It wasn't directly Bitcoin. It was kind of crypto, which is a very different thing. And I don't touch anymore. There's a lot of fraud as we've seen in 2022 in that industry. But, it kind of got through that initial period and eventually, I'd worked in the space doing some project management, doing some little bit of technical architecture. And, then I got I worked for, it was like a, what do you call it? There's this thing called local Bitcoins where it's like people want to meet up in person and buy it in cash. And this was like this, it was bigger in like 2013, 2014 when there weren't these big exchanges. It got smaller. I worked for a company that did something like that. And through that, I met a business partner who we collaborated together to start a software development agency. And that was really, that was the first thing like that I think that really started to take off in a more substantial way relative. Like I had some success and I did some great things and had some amazing clients prior to that. But the software agency started really going and having some great experiences. I mostly did kind of combination project management and sales there. And so that was kind of, we were working with large corporate clients. We were doing kind of things that are more discernible and notable, names people would recognize. So that kind of got some momentum and I learned a lot doing that. And then, what happened from there was, and so that was there were maybe, let's call it 2 years from absolutely nothing, just like me coming out the other side of this whole spiritual process and undertaking, and then probably 2 years to the point I'm talking about. So I'm I worked there, kind of partially co-founded, work as a project manager, some sales, and then I get connected with my current company where we do, so I run the high net worth, so we do, so recently I was the managing director for our private client team, which was like high net worth, white glove, concierge, think like a private banking experience for wealthier people that are interested in Bitcoin. So we're working with private wealth and helping them navigate and assess their investment trusts, and, business accounts and all that sort of thing, which is an amazing experience. So I was the managing director of that side. And recently promoted to the VP of Swan Global Wealth, which is that side of the company, which, I ran. So I got hired, to basically spin up. It was an emerging division. So our company had done, it was it was very retail focused in the beginning. So it was smaller clients coming in, maybe there's something called dollar cost averaging. So like buying, $50 every day, right? So, maybe a couple $1,000s a month, smaller clients on the retail side. And then in 2020 and in 2021, bigger clients start knocking at the door and saying, hey, I don't want $1,000 of Bitcoin or $5,000 of Bitcoin. I want $500,000 of Bitcoin. I want $1 million of Bitcoin. I want to put this in my portfolio. And so, I did have a background working on the consulting side with high net worth individuals, and I got brought on to spin up that department. At the start, it was just me, and this was this new idea. The company hadn't fleshed this out before, and it went really, really well. It went extremely well, and it grew tremendously. And so I was brought on to kind of spin that up, and then that later turned into leading the team. Originally, it was just me. A year later, there's, a team of, maybe at that point, 12 people or something. And so I was the managing director for that. We spun it up. Over 2 years, it grew from a new idea to, in certain timeframes, 60% of the company's revenue, like an extraordinarily successful division. And a lot of that was, I find it interesting because I think so much of what worked there was these non-process, kind of going back to the beginning of the conversation, like these non-process oriented, like what really moved the needle with our clients was, it was just real. It was relational. It was us really meeting them where they were and helping them, not selling them product and not pushing them through a funnel, and like just providing what they needed and being a resource for them. And that's what people love. Like it was real and it was authentic, and it still is today. And so, I led that side that grew 1.5 to 2 years. Recently promoted to the VP of our global wealth team. We're now expanding this, not just globally, but we've got retirement accounts, we have trusts, we have something called multi-sig, we're integrating a money market account, we have we're working with a couple private hedge funds and venture funds that are in the space, and it's expanding. The company has grown tremendously. We just completed our Series B. We've a bunch of executives joined us from Bridgewater, from Ray Dalio's hedge fund, from Ernst & Young, top 4 accounting, and then later Fannie Mae, from Visa, from Goldman and Sequoia-backed fintechs in Brazil. So just amazing talent that has wanted to come. And so the company has been very successful, and I've been able to succeed at the company, and the team that I've led has been extraordinarily successful. And so it's been over, basically 1.5, 2 years, start to finish, 3 if you add in, when I did, was doing project management on the software side. But that's a really short time, and I'm 30. I'm relatively young. A lot of people on my team are, much older than me, much more pedigreed than me. To be honest, like, they worked at Goldman, at Morgan Stanley for a decade, and I haven't, right? But thankfully, I'm in an organization that rewards competency, right? They reward results. And it's if I was in a large corporate environment, like I probably wouldn't be in the position I'm in. But I both recognized that opportunity. I saw that opportunity and was like, this is a big opportunity for me, and also something that I love. I really enjoy doing this. And it was all, I don't know, it all worked. It was all lined up, and I think it was good good for the company, good for the team, good for me, good for our clients. And that speaks to, so that's the story. And, you know, from many perspectives, that's compared to these kind of frameworks and roadmaps of people's lives, that's really quick, and that's not how it's supposed to happen. And there were a bunch of disjointed jumps and, you know, coincidences, or, you know, whatever you want to call them. But
And
that's just how
you've been quite active in the media as well. I was talking.
Yeah.
This is funny because you know, I live in a fairly rural part of BC, and I was talking with a buddy of mine. His kids go to the same school as my kids, and he's heavily into Bitcoin. He's got a couple of machines in his garage that are mining Bitcoins, and he's a Bitcoin geek. And you know, I was chatting with him. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm talking to a friend of mine, Steven Lubka, who I know through Facebook and my website, and he's a Bitcoin expert, and he works for Swan Bitcoin. And my buddy goes, "Oh, I know Steven. He was on that podcast, What Bitcoin Did." And I'm like, "Holy shit, Steven must be pretty famous if my buddy here in rural BC has heard of him." But that's that world, right? I think most people who are in that world have now been exposed to some form of you. So your trajectory has gone just beyond growth within the organization, but sort of as an influencer within the industry itself. Now, the question I want to ask you, because this is really interesting, it's on my mind because that's what I see in my own career with whether it be my writing or whether it be in the industry I work in, is you're right. You have these people, your peers, who are more experienced. They have a better pedigree, as you said. They've worked in those elite institutions. They've come from.
Just to be clear, and I don't say, and it is in no way denigrated. They're all amazing. I just because we're recording, I want to be super clear.
100%.
Amazing, smart, brilliant people. Just yeah. Go ahead.
Right, 100%, and that is true of my peers as well. The people I work with, I have high levels of respect for the expertise, the specialization, the amount of work they've put in their career. So that's not to put anyone down whatsoever. But having said that, there's a completely different arc here. And that's the point I'm trying to get to. Your arc and my arc, if we look at them, they follow a similar trajectory, which is very different from that trajectory, which has required so much upfront investment of time, energy, finances, education, all of that to gradually get to this point in their careers. Whereas here it's been kind of sort of hopping randomly, some random stepping stones that just popped up along the way, kind of like some kind of a video game, and you just see the stepping stone and you leap to it, as opposed to this structured path. Same was true of my writing and things like that. When I look back, I was never part of any spiritual circle. When I started up my page, I didn't even invite one person to my page, and just overnight gathered a readership. So I have my own answer for this, but I'm curious as to what your answer is to what is the difference here? Because again, highly respecting our peers, what they've put into their intelligence, their commitment to their work, their understanding and experience of the industry, all of that. But there's an X factor that you bring that may not be there. And what is that X factor? And is there any relation to your awakening experience? And let's dive back to the whole spiritual side of things.
Yeah. I mean, I have to think yes, right? You know, it's you can't really get a microscope out. You can't run a double-blind experiment where you see my life if that happened and my life if that didn't happen, right? So there's a little bit of, you know, guesswork or whatever you want to call it, right? So that being said, but I have to see it that way, because the thing that happened, I mean, after that, you know, after the awakening, you might find this interesting. So what happened the first 6 months after the awakening? It was actually my initial experience, but I'll come back to that. But my initial experience was I suddenly felt so intimate with my own life. I felt so close to it. It was like experientially close. I was like, whoa, I just feel like I'm right here. Like I'm right up against what's happening. And as that occurred, it became really apparent, like several different critical areas in my life that were not working for me, that were dysfunctional relationships, what I was doing, boundaries I hadn't held with people. And it was suddenly almost unbearable I was so close to them. It was like I'd been disassociated from them in some way. I'd been in some way compromised from them. And the first 6 months, it was like a total life overhaul. And, you know, I'm the sort of person, it was like, that was staring me in my face. And I'm like, well, okay, I'm just going to have to do something about this. I'm not just going to stare at this for years. Like, you know, this is it. And so there was a huge life overhaul. There was a huge just shift in a bunch of stuff that was really out of balance in my life. And on the other side of that, there may be 6 months, 8 months, whatever. Suddenly, this other quality takes over and things just start working out. Things just, like you said, there's this like disjointed, hopping around, coincidental thing, but it's this incredibly not ordered in the sense of like linear, but there was almost a sense of order to it from the experiential perspective. It felt experientially from my perspective like I was being moved through different circumstances which were appropriate for me at that time. And then when those situations which required my engagement, and there was a learning and growing, there was a change from that, when that had kind of reached whatever it was going to be, something new that I didn't expect opened up. And I went through that door. I often described it as like, what was asked of me was to say yes. What was really asked of me was like, I'm confronted with something. It might be like an opportunity. Sure. Okay. Like I need to walk through that door. It may also be something I'm doing wrong or a challenge or something I don't want to see about a situation. These were all part of it. And it was just this continual yes to life. Yes, I'll see it. Yes, I'll make the change. Yes, I'll take this new, maybe nerve-wracking opportunity, this new. And it's just this quality of life that I think became incredibly prominent post the awakening and was not there before, right? So I can look at that as something that changed. And I mean, things just really worked out, and they continued to work out in this. I like to like ordered, like there was order to it. It was cohesive. It was organized. It didn't feel like my life doesn't feel like this random order of events. Like it, you know, not to say that like I'm assigning a narrative quality to it or that I'm like, you know, I'm going here and I'm doing this. You know, you can look back and you can maybe do that, but it's not even from that perspective. There's just an implicit, contextual, direct experience of wholeness and order to the whole thing. It doesn't feel random. It doesn't feel disjointed. And that's just something that became incredibly prominent internally, externally. And so I have to feel like that's part of it. You know, I have to feel like that's part of it. And so what does that say? I mean, really what that says is that the way we engage in life influences what we get out of it. Duh. You know, like, of course that's true. We can know that that's true on a very conventional level. Like I can make secular arguments for like, you know, a nice person and an asshole go through life. The nice person has more good stuff happen to them. Why? Well, because they're fucking nice and people like them, you know? It's like you can make a secular argument. A Buddhist is going to call that karma. I could call it like literally you just don't piss off every person you meet and you have more opportunities, right? But so the notion that the way in which we engage in life isn't just an internal orientation, but results in outcomes, I think even from a secular basis makes complete sense. And, you know, I'm not averse to saying there's a metaphysical basis too, or something like that. I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, when I look at that juxtaposition of how I engage with life versus how I see other people engage with life, and I circle back to my initial awakening experience in my 20s, it was very much like yours. There was a suddenly slamming up against the wall of life. It's right here,
right? Like just
while
right here.
right there. Whereas it's been miles away, and I didn't
Yeah.
realize how far away it was. It was like a
I was back
tunnel
here.
vision
I
of,
was
yeah,
back here.
like you're inhabiting some
Yeah.
abstract space, and life is at a distance that you're watching through some lens of a screen of
Correct.
on a television, and
Yeah.
now you're bang up in it, right?
Yeah.
And you're inhabiting it.
Yeah.
What has happened as a result of that, as a lasting effect, is that immediacy has never gone. And so
Correct. Yes.
what I find I cannot ever cultivate is a fear of life itself.
Yeah.
I
No.
can have a fear. I can have a fear of certain circumstances or certain like imagined scenarios, but I can never be afraid of life itself. And so I can never bring myself to create the kinds of checks and balances and contingencies most people are naturally building in, right? And so the analogy I'd use is that of a rock climber, traditional rock climber, versus a free soloist like Alex Honnold.
Yeah.
Alex Honnold was as successful as he was, because he's purely talented, of course. I mean, the once in a generation kind of climber, but he's a purist. To him, it's just him and the rock. There can't be anything in the way. Are you familiar with Alex Honnold, the guy?
I'm not. I'm gonna look him up after this, though.
Yeah, you should. So he's the first person to ever free solo El Capitan or whatever in Yosemite, and a couple of other rock faces that had never been done. And he did it in 2 hours. And it's basically a sheer wall, like fingernail size cracks along the way, and that's about it. And he literally free soloed the whole thing at the age of 20 something. Like, and he lived out of his van in Yosemite for most of the year, just looking at the mountain, figuring out his path up. And he did it in 2 hours, and the whole rock climbing world was just like shattered by this. Like, how is this even possible? Because the record before that in the 20s was something like it took 4 days with experienced rock climbers, and then somebody managed to do it in 1 day or something like that. Don't quote me. I'm paraphrasing based on my limited memory, but there's a whole documentary about this guy. It turns out he also has a shrunken amygdala, which must help in the whole field response. But
helpful.
But the point, yeah, it's helpful. But as an analogy, I mean, maybe we have a shrunken version of a spiritual amygdala too. But as an analogy, it holds because most people are weighed down by all those checks and balances and safety nets they're constantly building in to buffer against what they think could go wrong with life, because they don't have that immediate relationship with life. It's like being in an arranged marriage with somebody where it's purely transactional and you're constantly trying to figure out there's no trust there, or there's minimal trust there, and you're constantly trying to negotiate the best outcome forward, as opposed to having that direct communication channel like my wife and I do, where we express it all to each other constantly, and the relationship spontaneously evolves from there in an unplanned way.
It's alive. Right? Yeah, it's alive. It's vital. It's real. It's dynamic, and it possesses a natural intelligence. Actually, what you mentioned amygdalas. Our conversation originally, I tagged you in a study that had been done, and we had some discussion. It was on meditators, and my kind of thing was like, well, if you really read it, they're talking about some sort of abiding thing that some of these people went through, and I'm willing to extend some credit there. But regardless, but I thought it was interesting because they identified, I think they're talking about, people that went through an awakening, maybe some of its transient states during meditation, maybe that transient state becomes an abide, who knows. But what they point out is that there is a decrease in the activity of the default mode network in the brain, which just really layperson's definition, let's just call it like the normalcy, and like if you're driving a car and you kind of space out and you arrive at your destination, like default mode network sort of types of activity took over. It's your biases, your heuristics, your business as usual. And then the central executive center, actually had an increase in activity. And I think for most people, if we just assume that this is about awakened people and this is accurate, I think most people in the spiritual world would, they'd agree with the like default mode network down, but they would take a lot of issue, or they'd be surprised by central executive functioning up, because it actually implies that your ability for clear decision, conscious decision making actually increases, rather than like your self dissolves, man, and there's no person there to make any decisions. It's all just life. Which, you know, on some like on the most absolute level, like, yeah, you know, it's true. Like there is no like, you know, but it's practically irrelevant, and it's experientially false in a sense. But so there's this increase, and you know, that almost speaks to, well, potentially one of the outcomes of this is actually you just become so much clearer. And that's something I've experienced, right? Like you just have the immediacy gives you intelligent points of contact. And this goes to something you got to read this guy if you haven't. Do you know Ian McGilchrist?
I've heard of him.
Okay. Phenomenal. I think he's building the successor to postmodernism on a philosophical lens in a really positive way, in a way that like reintegrates some of the more inherent things that modern ideologies have kind of said, oh, those are just constructed and don't exist, they're fake. But it's almost, you know, some of what he's saying, but that there is, you know, in the West, we are completely focused on one mode of knowledge. And what that mode of knowledge is that we inhabit the space of the detached scientific observer, and we, on a neutral basis, measure and monitor and slice life into pieces and measure components of it to arrive at knowledge. And that's how we know things. We know things by observing them and dissecting them and analyzing them. And that's not false, right? That is one way in which we can arrive at a certain type of knowledge about reality, like the speed of gravity, the speed that a ball falls, or how a given chemical compound works, or, you know, whatever. And part of the work that McGilchrist does is he's saying, well, these are actually corresponding to how different brain hemispheres actually see the world. And unlike a lot of the early brain hemisphere stuff, which is like debunked, and it's not that like both hemispheres do all things. It's not that like one does this and one does that, but they see the world in different ways. And the left hemisphere sees the world as component bits that it analyzes into pieces. The right hemisphere functions very differently. And what it does, it sees it as a whole. It sees it contextually. It sees it immediately. It sees it directly. And in it, it has this other mode of knowledge. And like an example of this is you listen to a piece of beautiful music. How do you know it's beautiful? You just do. Like, you don't need to analyze the tempo and how many beats per minute and where did they switch. Like, you can do that, but that's no longer the song. The song has now been disintermediated and you've been left with its component parts. The whole has been divided into the parts. And you actually have this, if you don't engage in that mode of cognition, you have this direct experience of the music, of the art, of life, which contains within itself a form of intelligence. And so I think, you know, that's a long way of saying, I think what we're getting at here, or what I'm getting at here, and I think you'd agree with, is this immediacy, the intimacy that one has with experience actually makes a form of intelligence come online. I think you're actually able to make more quote unquote intelligent decisions because you're in direct contact with the whole of life, not just, you're just like taking your little like microscope and analyzing the parts.
Yeah, we've become a very left hemisphere dominant culture. And I don't know if you watched the podcast I did with Chris Niebauer, who wrote the book No Self, No Problem, How Neuroscience is Catching Up to the Teachings of Buddhism. I'm not sure if I quoted that title correctly, but it's very much along those lines. And he broke it out very similarly, not taking it literally, because some of that has been debunked as it's not exclusively left versus right,
Yeah.
but I've maintained for a very long time, based on my own awakening experience, that it's not that experience of awakening is the absence of a self altogether. Not at all. It's a very different experience of self.
Yeah.
And the left hemisphere has a self, and the right hemisphere has a self. The left hemisphere's version of a self is an abstract self, because the left hemisphere works in abstractions. And so it's this idea of a self, it's an image of a self that it's, again, parts and components to it, that it then puts together like a piecemeal scrapbook approach to create a composite sketch, like an police artist would, of who I must be based on all these little inputs that I'm getting. Versus the right hemisphere is a much more amorphous sense of self, and that bleeds into the environment. There's no clear distinction between what this is and who I am, but there's a very strong sense of I am, of existence. Like, it doesn't have to be, broken out in that language either. And when Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, in her book Stroke of Insight, talks about, I don't know if you've read that book, there's a very famous TED Talk, and she had that stroke where she lost all ability to communicate and even, articulate who she was to herself and have thoughts. She lost the ability to practically function, but she had this experience of completely bleeding into an environment, and it was a very euphoric experience on one level and absolutely debilitating on the other level, because you need this juxtaposition, right? You need this abstract self that's composed of parts to relate to a society that is equally abstract, built on an abstraction of ideals and rules and laws and all of that, with moving parts, because that's the self that's now going to relate to that. And then underlying that structure of that abstract society is the reality of the natural world, which is not abstract at all. And then you need that other side that relates to the natural world. And that has to happen in tandem. If you go off to one extreme, you become completely debilitated in the practical aspects of life. You can't relate to people, society, there's rules, social mores and stuff. And if you tend towards the other extreme, which we have as a people, then you completely lose touch with, well, what is the ground-based reality? You take all this abstraction away. Tomorrow society collapses. Well, what the fuck am I doing here, right? And people have an existential crisis. And then they go into nihilism, which, life is meaningless and fucking pointless, shoot ourselves in the brain, because you don't have any means of connecting with what is happening, because all you ever thought was real was what that left hemisphere abstract self was relating and positing to be true through beliefs and all of this. So that balance between the two, and I often say that, unfortunately, the story of the Buddha ended up with him under the tree gaining enlightenment, but the way I wish it had ended was him going back to being a prince, because that would have brought the whole thing full circle and shown people, hey, you know what? Once you're enlightened, you still go back to doing the dishes and chopping the wood and ruling a kingdom, or whatever the fuck was your job in the first place. You go right back to it, because the point is it's not a linear path where you start here and you end up there. It's where you end up right back where you started, but now you've integrated all this shit through the journey of the self-discovery, which is always continuing.
Campbell. It's Joseph Campbell's return, in many ways. But yeah, and I agree with what you said on, like, it's the balance. Like, you need both of those modes of functioning. And his first book is called The Master and His Emissary. And the logic behind that title is that, like, the left hemisphere is the emissary. We send it out to do things, to function, to achieve goals. And that's important. And, like, we need that or we die. But it's not the master. And when we let it rule the castle and it's the supreme, things get really dysfunctional, right? And, like, the right kind of hemisphere view of the world, contextual wholeness, that needs to have more ultimate reality. There needs to be more reality in that view than in the abstract left view, but we need both. And we need both to function. And, I think you and I both are both, I certainly enjoy a good think and a good analysis, right? I'm very engaged in a lot of those discussions. I take a lot of joy and pleasure in them, right? There's a lot of meaning and there's purpose. Like there's purpose in these kind of models and abstractions and systems of philosophy and economy and technology, right? Like those are important things, and they're fine to participate in, to be good at, to enjoy, to even be like, you know, probably most people, I mean, I've encountered people that think I'm like one of the most analytical people they know, which is funny to me in some ways. Like I get it, like, but you know, I kind of laugh hearing that. I'm like, man, you know, like that's so partial. That doesn't occupy chief reality for me. But my point in sharing that is just to say that that's all fine. It's great, actually. It's good. Be good at that. Be fucking smart. Be analytical. Be good at abstraction and deduction, and you know, build a great software and do whatever the hell you're going to do. That's awesome. But just don't let that rule. Don't let that rule your kingdom. That's not your king. That can't be the realest thing you know. And if it is, you're going to be miserable.
Yeah, this master emissary breakout that you mentioned from Joseph Campbell, similar to the way I structure it, where I break it out into the head, heart, and the gut, where, you know, we have currently a top-down approach where the head rules. It's the one that's making the decisions, the strategic decisions. And then the heart kind of goes out and tactically figures things out. And the gut kind of just drags along, the intuition drags along, which is to say most people lack intuition altogether. It's not really cultivated in our society. Whereas the way I operate in my life is the reverse way. My intuition is what is leading the charge. It's really guiding the overall approach. The heart, which I call my yearning, my passion, is what is the driving force, is the fuel to go along that path. And then my brain's job is just to figure out the logistics, because that's what it's good at. Figure out the analysis, like, all right, how do I get from point A to point B? It's not my job, my brain's job to decide what point A and what point B should be. It's my brain's job to figure out how to get from point A to B. And so there's a clear breakdown of executive function. The executive function is actually not top down, it's bottom up in my case, right? And that is, again, you know, a difference that I see between the way society kind of gears us to operate versus the way I've learned to operate. Absolutely. I want to circle back, and I'm not sure how you're doing on time, and actually I can't even see what the time it is. Yeah, I can't even tell what time it is. So I'm on my phone, so I'm going to have to just look at the time. Oh, I'm good too. Okay. I'm good for another half hour.
Okay.
I want to circle back to something you said right in the beginning, okay? Because it's stuck in my mind. I'm like, not going to let go of that. I'm going to come back to this with Stephen. You mentioned at one point, I don't want to go off on a tangent. We were talking about the individual, right? And you said, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I don't see how the idea of an individual can mean anything without the concept of a soul. I want to explore that with you, because I do give off the impression when I write that I'm against metaphysics. Yeah. Again, I'm not against metaphysics, just like I'm not against manifestation. Yeah. I'm against the pseudoscience of metaphysics. I'm against the idea that now I can map out the Akashic records for you, and I can pull your fucking 75th past life out of there and tell you what you're doing wrong in this life. I'm like, come on. But I'm not opposed to the idea that anything might exist beyond this realm, as I'm not opposed to the idea that, you know, we might just be meat suits, that we die and that's the end of it, is blackness and the end. So I'm open to all models of reality, because really nobody knows. So let's explore that a little bit, and why you feel that for an individual to exist in this human experience of ours, there must be correlation to a soul type entity.
Okay, so two things there, because let's talk about that, because I do have thoughts on that. What I meant specifically was the idea of the individual. So not the experience, not the real individual, but that, like, Western culture deciding that people had rights was downstream of Christian theology. Like, no Christian concept of a soul, no human rights, no, you know, Declaration of Independence, no Constitution, this sort of no end of slavery. Like, this idea of that an individual somehow has some inherent fundamental, virtue and meaning, I think like is inseparable from the Christian idea of the soul. So what I was getting at there is more in a historical and like the idea lens. So, but if I were to think about the question you did ask, and I don't know. So this, I don't have like a completely firm. So the thing that I am against, so I think I feel more strongly than you on, I think the meat sack idea is wrong. I'm pretty opposed to that one. I think there's scientific evidence that doesn't explicitly confirm it, but is suggestive. I do think that the capacity, experience itself precedes matter. I really do believe that. But that aside, I have two models that I work on the concept of, is there some sort of like personal essence, right? Like, is there some sort of, like something lasting about like the individual? And I don't know. I'm willing to bet in some capacity, yes. But not in the way of like that Steven just transitions and is like, Steven Lubka is in some other world after he dies. I don't really believe that, but could be true, but I don't really believe that. What I think is like, there's basically two ways I look. So if I'm working off the assumption that like direct experience is the like ontological primary. It is the deepest metaphysical object. And there was like a blank screen with no objects in it of experience. And then like a dream, like when we're asleep at night and suddenly a world springs into being, suddenly a world sprang into being. And then within that world emerged individuals and matter and the appearance of matter and all these things. So in that paradigm, you can have two views. One is like, I die and I just like recede into the absolute. I recede into like the ultimate nature of reality. And, it's kind of this like, I'm just the absolute right now. And there's just this appearance of individuality. And when I die, I'm just one with everything. I'm just, in awareness or in the Godhead or whatever. And that's one view. And maybe that's true. Maybe this is like this flash in the pan appearance of personhood. But maybe it's not. Here's why I think it might not be true. So in the way I see this, I kind of work off this assumption that the only things which do exist because there is some inherent impulse in the fabric of existence towards those things, or otherwise they wouldn't exist, right? Like the world, there's something inherent in creation towards whatever it is that is fucking here. And of all the things that exist in the world, the single most complex and also unnecessary thing is self-awareness. There is no reason that the lights have to be on here. I do not need to be aware of my own experience. I could be a robot. If the world just wanted a human organism wandering around doing technology, I don't need to be self-aware, just like my computer isn't self-aware. I could just have calculations running, no consciousness needed to be the case. And you get into like the scientific debate, like no one knows why the fuck we're conscious, right? There's this huge hard problem of consciousness. There are no, in any way verifiable answers that say it's just a function of complexity in the brain and you get enough neurons together and suddenly the lights turn on and you're self-aware. Like bullshit. Nobody knows. So the most complex, but also unnecessary is the separate self. Why do separate self? Why does this appearance, like I'm seeing my lanai right now, you're seeing your office. We have this divided perceptual self-awareness sphere that we're inhabiting. why does that exist? Like, it could just as easily not exist. And it's very, very complex. It's very, like, you know, you think a table's complex, like differentiated self-awareness is the most complex thing.
I mean, we could essentially extend that question to pretty much anything. Like, we could say, why do life forms exist? The universe was getting along perfectly fine for
why,
billions and billions of years. Why did organic life have to evolve? Like, what's the purpose of that? But then, you know, you could argue, why does planets or nebulae or gases exist, right? It's the same thing. So me personally, if I had to take an intellectual position on it, my intellectual position is always going to be one of, I will always lean conservative to what I can speak intelligently to. And so from an intellectual position, I have to be bang in the middle, because I have not seen enough evidence on either side to clearly validate that one is more likely than the other. However, if I look at my personal intuition on the matter, I lean more towards what you're talking about, because I myself, you know, in my own experience, I've had experiences which I'm not able to explain in any other way than to say there has to be some precursor to this phenomenon, rather than just saying it's a random event. And what I found maybe best explains this is just, again, this is just a hypothesis, not even a theory, but it's a hypothesis, but it's a simulation hypothesis. Is the idea that if we can, and we already see we can, inhabit an abstract artificial reality in a way that's so all-consuming that we can actually forget that we exist in another reality. And that's starting to happen more and more as VR and AI and the internet becomes more and more immersive in its experience. And it's trending towards a point where it's going to be completely immersive one day, possibly, in the not too distant future too. Then all you would really have to do is tweak the mechanism that helps you recall that you exist in another reality. So if I can already be a Facebook avatar in Zuckerberg's metaverse, and if I can live there as obsessively as some people spend time on Instagram, and I can then live with an avatar with filters that make me feel better about myself than my actual body does, and that becomes my life 24/7, to a point where I dissociate from my identity in this life, well, then I'm already in another universe that it's been created and has an intention, all of that. So my simple argument is not really to assert that that's what's happened, but to ask the question, how do we know it hasn't happened? And I don't think anybody can really answer definitively that it has not already happened. And so that remains a very real possibility in itself.
And so, interestingly enough, the simulation hypothesis is metaphysically identical to what I'm suggesting, except I'm just saying there's no alien machinery somewhere. It is otherwise identical. It is saying that, like, we are in, like, there is a precursor to this experience, and I'm just saying that precursor is like this ontological ground of awareness that exists for no one knows why. No one knows why it exists. But is otherwise identical to the metaphysics of, like, a simulation hypothesis. But to finish the thought of why I would probably lean on the side that there's something continuous about experience. So one is this notion that the most complicated, complex thing that exists is self-aware organisms that are differentiated. And if we assume, as I like to assume, that there's some impulse in existence itself that has led to that being versus not being, then existence has, and there's obviously assumptions here, but existence has a desire for differentiated beings. It views it as, in some way, like, more evolutionary. It is in some way a creative process. And then what is the other thing that I think is an inherent quality of the universe that I observe? Well, the universe is evolutionary. And we can see this everywhere. We can see it in biological life. We can see it in you know, just the process of the universe coming into being. We can see it in our personal life. We can see it in the lifespan. The universe tends towards, despite the forces of entropy, the creation of greater and greater complexity. And you know, we evolve. You know, you were saying earlier in our conversation, like, the person you're going to be at 60 is going to be more evolved than you are today. There is this evolutionary impulse as we go. Even if all I look at is the life that I experience and the life that I'm assumedly going to experience, I am evolving as a complex person throughout that life. And that's like an inherent part of what it means to be alive and to be human. And so if I take those two capacities and just assume that the world has some sort of existence, has some sort of impulse, some sort of want of those capacities, we have differentiated beings and an evolutionary track to those beings' existence. So why would that stop at death is where I'm going. Like, if we want differentiated beings and we want evolution, then it's not that much of a stretch for me to think this just continues eternally or in some way.
You know, so one of the dangers of this argument, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with your argument. In fact, I actually agree with your argument on many levels. But one of the cultural impacts, and this is where I say dangerous, is when people argue. When people argue, well, why do you assume we are the first iteration of that differentiation? That's a very valid question to ask. Is you're saying there's some nebulous awareness that's at the root of this differentiation of life forms and self-awareness. One can argue, and many people actually will posit that, yes, if you retract all the way back to the root structure, there's that awareness. But there's already been many layers of differentiation of consciousness and beings. The Buddhists will call it the hierarchy of, you know, divine beings. The Christians will call it the divine chain of beings, or whatever they call it, where you have angels and archangels and all of that. New Ages will call it like different dimensions that with civilization occurs. So we go into that whole realm of New Age and spiritual metaphysics, where people have posited this for a long time. And even at the very simple level of, well, you know, just as humans are evolving through this lifetime, we are souls which are reincarnating in many lifetimes in order to evolve from the life lessons of many human lives and animal lives maybe. And so there's this root structure that's differentiating and expanding. And now technologically, Steven can have 15 different avatars, each having their own narrative and each evolving in their own way. And through the evolution, Steven himself is evolving. And then add one more layer of technology to that, and that each avatar might have, and you can keep expanding, you know, beyond. It becomes a rabbit hole.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not to say that isn't the way it's happening. I don't know. But how does one manage that, right?
So the thing I take issue, not like I agree with that assessment. The thing I don't think happens is that it's Steven that's evolving. That it's like as like Steven Lubka is somehow, you know. And so that in the way I see it, that question kind of gets dissolved, because basically the only thing I think, I have no idea, like, okay, what qualities persist? Man, my personal qualities don't persist to next year. I change. So the notion that like my personal attributes are in some way going to persist my own death when they don't persist 10 years of my life sounds silly to me. However, what is the thing I think does persist that leads me to say that there's something? I think it's just the differentiated stream of awareness. So like if I close my eyes right now and I open them, I see something. There is something in front of me. I am having a perceptual experience. My only real claim is that at the moment of death, there is a next experience. I have no idea what it is or what form it takes or what sort of consistency. It's just that this like present moment stream of awareness that we're inhabiting now in some way persists. It is non-interrupted, or it is interrupted in some minor way, like when we sleep, like, we sleep and then we wake up and, there's a, dreaming period, and maybe there's a period where there's no objects.
So I see a minor contradiction in there, Stephen, which is, so there's awareness and then there's a content of awareness. Yep. And I see only the content ever evolving. Awareness doesn't really evolve. It's like just this vessel, this container of what's happening. Right. So if we even talk about evolution, there has to be a Steven Lubka evolving, because awareness is not evolving. Something is evolving. Now it's Steven Lubka. Tomorrow it could be Steven Lubka's Facebook profile. There could be the soul that is manifesting as Steven Lubka. At every level of this hierarchy, there's evolution happening, but it's always to some projected form of content. It's some level of a separate self.
Yeah.
There's at the cyber level, the separate self is your Facebook avatar. Then there's your LinkedIn avatar, and those are your separate selves. At the human level, it's Steven Lubka. If there's a soul level, then that's the soul that is these manifestations, of which one is Steven Lubka. But there is that separation. What you're saying is ultimately it all cycles up to this awareness itself, of which we can be aware of right now, at the level of which there is no separation. So it doesn't matter if there's 5,000 levels, infinite levels. It doesn't matter how many hurdles it is all the way down. At the root, there's nothing. There's this empty, open awareness, which cycles back exactly to what non-duality is about. And even to what Zen is about. When Zen masters were traditionally asked, what do you think about life after death? They would famously say, worry about your life right now. Don't fucking worry about life after death. They weren't answering the question because there's no way to answer that question. They don't want to get caught up in that question, because that just becomes a massive distraction from kind 100%. Of the point of life right now, which is just be here now and just enjoy this. Because if there's going to be something else, there's going to be something else, and you're going to have to enjoy that, not think about this life that you didn't spend enjoying. So that's kind of the trend there, is that it doesn't actually matter. And that's more of where I come from when I talk about metaphysics, is not that there are people, there's many writers and my contemporaries who are totally against this fucking metaphysical idea. They're like, no, absolutely not. It's just a biological reality, scientifically validated. There's an end, and this is life, and all of that. And I don't really subscribe to that.
Metaphysics, which is itself a set of metaphysical assumptions, which,
Exactly.
No, I mean, I agree. So I agree that, like, for somebody engaged in like a spiritual pursuit, this is the most irrelevant question in the world. It is completely non-functional. It is completely irrelevant to any sort of process. But we're humans and we're curious and we like to think about things. I
had this experience when this was a year after my first daughter was born. All right. I was heavily immersed in some of these channeled writings. The book of one by the entity called Ra or something like that. I haven't read it in a very long time. But that's the name of my next. That's my music persona, an entity called Ra. That's my band. No, I'm kidding. So it's this channel teaching from the 70s that is very kind of seminal in that world of channeling and all of that. So anybody who's been immersed in that has heard of the law of one and all of that, right? And so it's these people channeling this entity called Ra. And, Ra obviously being the sun god, the Egyptian sun god, and all of that. And so I would have been heavily reading this book for days. And that night, I went to bed just like I always did. My daughter she was younger than one, because she was actually, she was just a couple months old, because she was sleeping in a little bassinet between the two of us on the bed. And I lay down and I'm looking up at the ceiling, as I often do before I start going to sleep. And as I'm looking at the ceiling, and I've talked about this in the past, I think, when I've written, I began to see this writing appearing on the wall in light.
Yeah.
And it was mirror writing. So it's all written backwards. Okay. Now I happen to be able to read mirror writing. Right? I can. So apparently, some people can't. I didn't know this. Like, if you flip letters over, I can still read just as well. But I'm reading this mirror writing, but that's appearing on the wall, and it's all this weird. I can recognize the alphabets, but the words don't make any sense to me. And then this eye appears. This like I'm looking at the ceiling just as I'm talking to you. This eye appears on the wall in light, and it's kind of like the eye on the dollar bill and the pyramid of Freemasons. Right. So this is all sounding very, very, very like woo woo right now, but I'm just narrating what happened. And I'm looking at this, and the next thing I know, my body starts floating up in the air, or the sensation of floating upwards. So I'm having an out of body experience, and I begin to panic. I have this strong sense of, holy fuck, what is going on? I'm wide awake. I look at my wife and my daughter sleeping next to me. I start floating upwards, and I start kind of push back with my hand like you would in a pool when you're treading water and your body's floating up against your will. Start floating up, and the words flashing in my mind, I'm not ready. And immediately, whatever this sucking force is, just completely relaxes. I just feel myself floating right back into my bed. And I'm just like looking around like, what the fuck just happened? So that was my first out-of-body experience that happened out of the blue spontaneously. But again, it had a lot to do with that yearning component, that hyper focus into the material, right? So I cannot separate the two. I can't say I had this, I was being harvested by aliens.
Sure.
But I also can't say the book had nothing to do with it. There's some kind of a relationship there. There's a suggestiveness to the mind and the subconscious, trying to recreate an experience that maybe subliminally you're trying to have that you're not consciously aware of. But there's a connection there. And so, I've tried to explain it both ways to myself, and neither explanation is satisfactory. To say it's just the suggestiveness of my brain, or saying, oh yeah, Ra was harvesting me there, right?
Yeah. So this is interesting. And so this is, if I were to make where I come from in this discussion is, like you said, it's more of a direct, experiential, intuitive place. If I were to make like an intellectual argument, if I were to make like an evidence-based argument, I do think there's actually some stuff we can point to. So first of all, the research on children who remember past lives is staggering. It is truly, truly verifiable and staggering. And there are these kids that remember information they could not have known in highly specific details that has been verified. And like, there's an entire group of scientists that basically study, and they throw out like 80% of the cases, like, well, they could have picked that up from the parents, or they could have like heard it here, or they could have like, a million things. But what they're left with is still hundreds of cases of children with highly specific knowledge. And so that's one thing I think you can point to that has received like a fair empirical treatment. Of there does seem to be some evidence of, now what's the mechanism behind that? Is it that we actually have past lives? Is there some sort of information bleeding through that, like, that wasn't actually your life? We're just somehow able to, like, sometimes these kids have, like, they not only remember it, but they have a birthmark in the exact place that they got stabbed, or, whatever it is. It's pretty compelling. That's one thing. Another thing that I find interesting that isn't quite as, it's not quite as empirical as that, but the like insane similarities in near-death experiences from people, like even people with like you said, like, okay, well, maybe you read these books and like you trigger some sort of experience. Like there are people in Iraq that like are staunch materialists that get blown to pieces on a fucking landmine. And then they're having the same sort of structural near-death experience that, these podcast circuit people are having. Like it's not that they're all exactly the same. It's not that the content is identical, but that the common thread is these people seem to end up in this other space, this other reality or whatever, where there are other conscious beings like there are here. And there's almost like a cognizance that you were just living that life. you were in that life and now you're in this life. And that seems to be a theme that, I'm not gonna say it's universal, like there's no cases that don't have that, but it seems common even across secular populations. And then I think
Well,
one other
and beyond just the near death, because I know this has also been, explained by some people as, from a scientific perspective. Oh, there's this, what happens when a person is just about to die, there's a dump of DMT that happens in the brain, and it creates a hallucination, very similar hallucinations, same tunnel, meeting loved ones. And so there's a theory as to why that happens from,
Have you ever talked to people who take DMT? Because that's not what it's like.
Right.
It's like there's machine elves in the geometry dimension.
Yeah.
Continue.
But then, but you go beyond that. There's even documented cases. And I in my 20s, I read this book called The Destiny of Souls, and by what was his name? Jeez. I want to say L. Ron Hubbard, but that's a Scientology. Michael Newton. Michael Newton. Again, so when I put my skeptical hat on, I'm trying to break these people down, right? Like trying to find that flaw in their character, and something about them that completely invalidates the work they've done, which is not necessarily the right way to go about it either. But when I read that, what he did was a lot of past life regression, but he also ended up doing what he called life between life regressions, where he would regress people back previous to their birth, but post their past death. And they would begin describing the afterlife, for lack of a better word. And he documented hundreds and thousands of these case studies from different cultural background, different religious beliefs, all of that. And all of their descriptions kind of congregated around the same description of what this reality was like. And I remember as I was reading it, usually when I read, I'm a pretty visual guy. Usually when I read, I generate, pictures and visuals of what I'm reading. But I was getting crazy flashbacks to this whole thing of exactly what this guy was talking about. And at the time, I was very much, oh, that must be what happened. Now I'm little less like, just take things at face value. But I cannot deny that it felt absolutely not true, but so familiar. Familiar as I read that. And it just felt like, yes, this makes absolute sense. This was what it was like. But the brain within the black box that it exists cannot possibly validate that, right?
Sure. Yeah, non-verifiable. So something I'll say I think maybe something that predisposes me to being, it's definitely not the only thing, but maybe one thing that predisposes me to being sympathetic to this view is it's kind of something like what you said. It's an experience I had, but it's when I was a kid. So when I was like 6 years old, I don't know what the hell was going on, but I laid in bed and I started thinking about, I was just asking myself the question, like I'd never thought about it. I was like a 6-year-old. I was like, what happens after death? And me laying there just like started thinking about it. Like I didn't go ask my parent. I just like laid there and I was like, I wonder what happens after death. And I just still to this day remember that like the thing that felt true to me at that time was like, oh, you end up in this like other space that I was in before, where you kind of like, maybe choose is too strong of a word, but you maneuver into your next life from this in-between space. And as like a 6-year-old, and like, my mom was kind of new age, and maybe somehow that, it's certainly not impossible that, but no one had ever said that to me. Like no one had ever said that to me, like explicitly, like, and it just was something that as a 6-year-old, like just felt like obviously true, like just obviously true. And I remember just laying there thinking me like, oh, well, in my next life, I want to do it like this. And who knows, certainly not verifiable, but that did happen. And I can't say it didn't happen. And I was fucking 6. I didn't have an agenda, unless, unconsciously. But I think my stance is mostly that there's enough evidence to me that I think it is a good skeptic can't discount this. You can't say this is definitely not true. I think there is enough, assessing some of these past life, like literally verifiable information, the way that near-death experiences across cultures and across different religious backgrounds have a lot of the shared content. I think there's even some of the out-of-body stuff where there was like verifiable information that they could only have seen if like the locus of consciousness was in a different part of the room. They've tried this. I think there's enough there that to kind of say this is like a ridiculous notion, I think is not of good intellectual quality. Like, I think there's enough to give oneself like, yeah, maybe like this is definitely possible. Are we ever going to be able to know it's true? Probably not. It's one of those qualities of human life that,
but we've lost that curiosity as a culture.
Yeah.
I feel like you can tell what people are interested in based on what society invests its resources towards investigating and studying and all of that. And clearly in the last 100 years, there has been very, very minimal funding or research or anything put in this direction. So it's no surprise that has kind of fallen into the hands of the pseudoscientists, because nobody else wants to really touch that subject matter, right? When I write, the reason I don't take this sort of open-ended stance is because I've noticed, and because I noticed this in myself in the past, I noticed this in a lot of people who are spiritual seekers out there, is they take what they feel is missing within themselves and want to find it in the form of what's missing in what they know about the world, right? They feel like, okay, so I know X, Y, and Z about the world, but if I figure out A, B, C, that will be the missing piece to what I feel is that void inside me, which are not one and the same at all. Because I found that post-awakening, and as I am today, I know just as much about reality as I did when I was that suffering, unawakened idiot of a person in my 20s. Exactly the same amount, yet the inside is completely transformed. So it was unrelated to getting any of this special knowledge. And so this is why I steer away, because even to give them the hint of that, they're off to the races. That's another way to diffuse that yearning. And I'm trying to take away all those opportunities to diffuse the yearning. I want that yearning to burn bright within the people who have it. The people who don't have it, it's fine. Like, their lives are also fine, and they will live out whatever they're oriented to live. But the people who do have it, it's so important not to diffuse that. And I feel like the spiritual culture is set up to soothe them, to make them feel better, more calm, more at peace, and to completely take away all those motivators within us that makes us want to wake up. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Something you said that I think you're talking about, like, it was unrelated to the content of your experience, and yet there was this shift. I don't know if I've shared this with you before, but I'll share it again, because this was just like, it was so raw for me. This was just my raw experience. Like, the moment, maybe a week after I woke up, right? Like, so there was kind of like maybe like a little intermediary sort of high. Like, it was like, oh my God, it's different, in a way. But like a week after, I was angry. I was pissed. I was pissed because nothing changed. And I was sitting there and I was like, everything is exactly the same. And holy shit, have I wasted all my time? And I was literally angry. I was upset. I remember talking to my girlfriend, and I was like, we were kind of in conversation. I'm like, don't even do it. It's fucking pointless. Like, nothing changes. You don't get anything. And from that perspective, that's actually completely true. You don't get anything. You don't get some alteration to the content of your experience. Now, was that the whole perspective? Did I feel like that for long? No, I didn't feel like that for long, because also underneath it, like, the way I was experiencing everything was irrevocably changed in a way that is like the most important thing in the world to me, and I would never give up, and I would never change. And so, like, you can't say it's like not whatever, it's not something, it's an, but the part of me that was looking to awakening, to spirituality, for some alteration to the content of my experience. Something you said earlier that I really resonated with is people do it because they don't want to handle the world. They're intimidated by the world. They're intimidated by the bills and the work and the challenges and, health and everything else. And so this is like a get out of jail free card. It's I'm just going to achieve freedom and I'll be good. I don't have to handle any of this like everybody else. And so to that part of me, which was a part of me and was part, there was that psychology in it for me too. I'm not going to say it wasn't there because it was. That part of me was like, I didn't get anything, nothing, total rug pull, total scam. Like everything's exactly the same. All my feelings feel exactly the same. Pain feels exactly the same. I have no special knowledge. I have no anything, and I was pissed. I was truly pissed.
Yeah, it's fascinating. My reaction post the honeymoon phase of euphoria and wow, wasn't anger. It was actually fear. It was this holy fuck, nothing changed. Now what do I do? And then it became a desperate, okay, let me go back to when I was feeling really, really good, because then I wasn't afraid, but I couldn't get back there. So then it becomes this shit. Now I'm off on this other tangent. Maybe I need to just do more of that. And then it became about like meditating more and all of that. That didn't help until finally coming around to the fact that you can't escape any of this any which way you try. And that's the beautiful thing about the immediacy is A, recognizing that there is no escape. How can you? You're immediately here. And B, not wanting to escape. Not wanting to escape anything that's happening, even if it's the shitty stuff that's happening. Not wanting to escape because you're in it. You're here. Where's there to go, right? Steven, you're a brilliant guy, and I love talking to you. Hang around in the backstage a little bit. We'll chat a little bit more, but I'm going to kill the recording and hope viewers really enjoy this podcast today.